Negotiations between worlds. Dinner was quiet and quite formal, something rarely done at the Dragon's Veil. Miss Emily Thurgood was nothing short of a tyrant when it came to formal dinners for the Gilgamesh, because he so rarely had them. She ran that household with an iron fist, and Stephanie, for one, was grateful. She kept everything organized and proper, ensuring every protocol was adhered to with military precision, and dinner was no exception. From the main course to dessert, she orchestrated course after course, brought from the kitchen to the table by the staff. Normally, conversations were abundant and joyful during one of her dinners, but not tonight. The dining room was as quiet as a church. Everyone seemed focused on their meal, not willing to talk about anything. The mood was especially uncomforting, with Eleonora at one end of the table and the Gilgamesh at the other, with Oswin, Pomber, Lady Stephanie, and Rona between them. Amelia stood directly behind Lord Moondrake, not taking her eyes off Eleonora for 1 second. She sat there, eating her food quietly, flanked by 2 members of the Hildrago Bog, cutting each morsel into a tiny bite that she ate with quiet precision and speed. She ate as if to nourish herself, not to enjoy the delicacies before her. Oswin, ever the politician, was first to break the silence. "Emily, you've outdone yourself," he complimented. "If there's one thing I miss about Emir, it's your cooking. I shall have to steal you away so you can properly train the cooks in New Camelot." "Yes, indeed, Miss Thurgood," Chancellor Pomber added, not to be outdone by Oswin. "It was an absolutely stellar meal." Emily blushed from the compliments. "Well, thank you both very much. It was my pleasure," she said with a curtsy. "But I wouldn't get any ideas of taking me away from Emir, Chamberlain," she stated to Ulrich. "You'd have to fight Lady Moondrake for me, and I doubt you'd win." "No, they wouldn't," Stephanie said good-naturedly. A snicker came from the other end of the table. Everyone turned to look at Eleonora, who just sat there and continued to eat without even looking up from her plate. The Gilgamesh was frustrated to no end at the rudeness of Lady Lilladora's representative. He knew he needed to put her in her place as quickly and diplomatically as possible. "Emily, would you please give us some privacy?" Lord Moondrake asked. "We have some important matters to discuss." "Of course, my lord," Emily replied with a quick curtsy, as she motioned for the staff to follow her out. "First and foremost, I want to be up front with all of you," Brian started. "I know the commanding officer of the ship off Avalon." Everyone was surprised to hear this, including Eleonora, who stopped eating and looked up for the first time. "His name is Captain Larry Rich. He was my officer in charge during my military duty in the Navy. He was, in many ways, a mentor for me as a young sailor." "Did he recognize you?" Oswin asked. "No, I don't think so," the Gilgamesh assured him. "I think my ears and older features threw him off. In any case, I wanted you to know that before we go out to the ship." "And are there any other surprises you haven't told us?" Eleonora asked curtly. "As a matter of fact, I do. I have several captured Outlander soldiers in my dungeon," Brian replied without missing a beat. Pomber spat out his food and drink across the table. While Stephanie tended to Pomber, Eleonora jumped out of her chair and slammed her fist on the table. Rona cautiously placed her fingertips on the hilt of her sword, glancing back to the Gilgamesh as if waiting for a command. He just quietly shook his head, which Rona took to mean she should be patient. "Who are these Outlanders, and how did they breach Avalon?" she demanded. Brian just sat there, calm and collective, which infuriated Eleonora even more. "They are called Spetsnaz, Special Forces for the Russian Federation," he explained. "I guess you could say they are comparable to the Hildrago Bog." "Nothing is comparable to the Hildrago Bog," Eleonora exclaimed. "Do not liken these Outlanders to the army of 10,000 years, ever." The Gilgamesh simply nodded his head in understanding. In any case, they arrived on Emir via a parachute from high altitude. Some of them didn't survive the jump because their equipment failed as soon as they crossed the barrier. Others died when they ran into some dragons on our northern edge. I already informed Captain Rich that I was holding them prisoner until we arrive for our first negotiations. Then I will turn them over to him for dispensation." "What? Is this what you call justice on Emir?" Eleonora fumed. They should be publicly executed for their transgressions. That is not for you to decide, Eleonora, the Gilgamesh snapped back, his tone now more commanding. I am Lord of Emir, and the decision is mine, and mine alone. In the hope of forging peaceful negotiations with the Outlanders, I will not shed first blood. Of course you won't, Gilgamesh, because you do not care about Avalon or the interests of Avalon. All you care about is your precious Outlanders. Now see here, Eleonora, Lord Moondrake has defended Avalon since the day he arrived on our shores, Oswin retorted. He has taken arms against every enemy that threatened Avalon, saving countless lives in the process. Not everyone, Eleonora snapped back. Aha! Brian shouted as he leapt out of his seat. Everyone looked at the Gilgamesh with a confused glance, unsure of where he was going with this. I knew it. Lady Lilladora didn't ask you to come to Emir. You volunteered, didn't you? Eleonora said nothing, and Brian pressed on. You jumped on the chance to come to Emir, but not for honor or duty to Alfheimer. You did it for revenge, to get back at me. You're mad. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, as sweat trickled down her brow. The Dubin was unaccustomed to sweating. Yes, you do. Huevos caris quasli ebris stult. Brian cursed at her in Elvish, calling her a lying, drunken fool. Eleonora gritted her teeth as she leapt at the Gilgamesh. She jumped on the table and sprinted towards him. Then, in one quick motion, she whipped her hair around and snapped it toward him as the poisoned spike on the end arched right at Lord Moondrake. This was a move she'd done thousands of times in battle, one that had never missed, until now. Brian caught the spike just before it reached him. He used her momentum and pulled her down to the table, face down. In one swift motion, he pinned her to the table by placing his foot on her braid and drew Twilight. The two Hildrago Boak drew their weapons to defend Eleonora, as did Rona and Amelia. The two Hildrago Boak drew their weapons to defend Eleonora, as did Rona and Amelia, getting between them and the Gilgamesh. Brian didn't want anyone else involved in this. Teneru, he shouted in Elvish. Devskoish Pogane. The elves stopped their advance and sheathed their weapons. Brian had declared his right of challenge, and since Eleonora attacked first, the elves had no choice but to accept it. It was a matter of honor for them. Rona and Amelia kept their weapons drawn and ready, waiting for the Gilgamesh to command them. He nodded at the two shield maidens. They immediately sheathed their weapons. Everyone's attention was now focused on Brian and Eleonora. Brian brought Twilight close to the base of her scalp. She struggled against his weight on her hair, pinning her to the table. She didn't even try to draw her sword, as the positioning was awkward and she would be instantly disarmed. At least let me draw my sword, she exclaimed. You have declared the right of challenge. I must be allowed to defend myself. In a minute. I'm going to say a few things first, and if you make any more aggressive moves, I'll give you a pixie cut like you'll never forget. Did you honestly think you could assassinate me without any repercussions to yourself, or is it that you just don't care if you lived or died? You have no idea what you're talking about. This is about Ionis, isn't it? A quiet hush fell across the room at the mention of Brian's longtime friend Ionis. He was the first elf the Gilgamesh met when he arrived on Avalon. He was a fierce warrior and a good friend to all who knew him. Ionis was killed more than a year ago at the hands of Morgana Le Fay. She demonstrated the power of the dark tides, reducing Ionis to dust by destroying the magic within him. Eleonora's demeanor changed immediately, as the pain of his death rushed over her. It was your fault, she screamed. You cared nothing about saving him. You only care about your whore Outlander daughter. Out of nowhere, a dagger plunged between Eleonora's braided hair and into the table. Lady Stephanie, still gripping the dagger in her hand, leaned her face close to the elf's. Call my daughter a whore again, and I'll be the one giving you a haircut, she whispered to Eleonora. Brian pulled out the dagger and gave it back to Stephanie before releasing his weight off Eleonora's hair. She quickly sprang to her feet and drew her sword, ready to fight the Gilgamesh. But Brian sheathed his sword and stood there before her, arms wide in a non-threatening stance. Let's finish this, Gilgamesh. You've declared Ayush Pogane, and it must be answered.